The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
To learn about and discuss best practices to fund transportation and spend funds wisely. This webinar is a continuation of that work. This webinar was made possible by the Rockefeller Foundation, which has supported these activities via their Equitable, Sustainable Transportation Initiative. Next slide, please. Thanks to any Natural Resources and Infrastructure Committee members that have joined us. This is the first webinar in the Natural Resources and Infrastructure Committee's webinar series on a range of energy, environment, transportation, and agriculture topics, which will be occurring on almost a weekly basis from now until the end of June, and you can see the information up on the screen there. A few housekeeping items to keep in mind before we get started. There may be a small delay advancing the slides. This webinar will be available on the NCSL website after the recording, and we will send along an email with the link to that website as well as the link to the Natural Resources and Infrastructure Committee's webinar series. And please submit questions for our panelists throughout their presentations using the question toolbox on the right-hand side of your screen. We'll save Q&A until after the presentations of our two speakers, and I will be reading the questions aloud. Go to the next slide, please. Here are the experts that will be presenting on our panel today. Next slide, please. To set the stage for today's webinar, U.S. travel trends are changing, and those changes are profoundly impacting transportation funding, financing, and spending decisions. Less driving. The number of miles each American drives annually has fallen each year since 2005. Mode share. Trips by transit, bicycling, and walking are all at levels not seen in decades or ever. Demographic shifts. The millennial generation is showing a particular preference for traveling by non-auto modes, and as baby boomers continue to retire, the number of vehicle miles they are traveling is likely to decline further. The sharing economy, as options like car sharing, bike sharing, and transportation services such as UberX and Lyft proliferate, Americans' reliance on their own personal vehicles is lessening. And lastly, alternative fuels. Use of alternative fuel and high-efficiency vehicles is on the rise. As our presenters will discuss, these trends have serious implications for transportation funding streams and future spending decisions. It is now my pleasure to introduce my esteemed colleague, Jamie Rawl. Jamie is a program manager in NCSL's transportation program. In addition to transportation funding and finance, Jamie's other research and publications have addressed specialized transit, public-private partnerships, rail, aviation, transportation technologies, and other issues. Jamie is also the lead member staff of the NCSL Standing Committee on Natural Resources and Infrastructure, made up of more than 800 state legislators and legislative staff from across the country. Jamie, go ahead and give it a go.
Thank you very much, Douglas. And I understand we had some technical difficulties, and that the very first part of that was muted. So I want to welcome again everyone to this National Conference of State Legislatures webinar on sustainable state transportation funding and spending, a topic that has become a very hot issue across the states in the last couple years. For those of you who don't know, NCSL is a nonprofit bipartisan organization regarded as the nation's leading authority on state legislative issues. And this webinar today is carrying on our work over the past couple years on transportation funding and financing topics. I'm so pleased to be a part of this webinar, and today I'll be focusing on the funding side of the equation, the question of why and how states are actively working to bring in transportation revenues that will be able to keep pace with investment needs into the future. So let's start with the bad news. Finding ways to fund and finance transportation projects certainly isn't a new challenge for states. The issue, however, has reached a new level of crisis and high-profile attention in the past few years. States across the nation now face a well-documented and worsening transportation funding crisis, and it's characterized by a chronic structural gap between transportation infrastructure needs and current revenues at all levels of government, federal, state, and local. Experts agree that the nation as a whole is spending only half to a third of what is needed to maintain and improve the nation's transportation system. There are many reasons for the funding gap, including years of underinvestment coupled with aging infrastructure and growing transportation demand. Also, gas tax revenues, which are still by and large the primary source of state and federal transportation funding, have not kept up with needs, for reasons that include some of the travel shifts that Douglas mentioned, as well as the plummeting purchasing power of gas taxes in light of inflation and rising construction costs. This lovely word cloud shows the revenue sources that states have used to fund roads, bridges, rail, and transit. The larger text shows the more common revenue sources. These state-level revenues are especially important because states provide nearly half of all surface transportation funding. As you can see, states rely very heavily on gas taxes. Every state levies taxes on gasoline and diesel, and gas taxes provide close to 40% of all state revenues for highways by our most recent calculation. Other revenue sources from the most to least common include various fees, sales taxes and tolls, general funds, and an assortment of other sources such as congestion pricing and state lotteries. This American Petroleum Institute map shows gas tax rates across the country as of this month. They range widely across the states, from 8 cents a gallon in Alaska to about 53 cents a gallon in California. Nationwide, the average state gas tax is about 31 cents a gallon. One problem with the long-term sustainability of the gas tax as a source of transportation revenues is that in most states, gas taxes have been assessed on a flat cents per gallon basis, where the same number of cents are collected per each gallon of gas purchased year after year, regardless of inflation or construction costs. And many states haven't raised these taxes for a long time. This graph from the Institution on Taxation and Economic Policy shows how long it has been since states last raised their gas taxes. As of this month, 16 states have not raised their gas taxes in more than 20 years, and no state raised its gas taxes in 2010, 2011, or 2012, although that trend was disrupted last year. As a result of these stagnant rates, after accounting for growth in construction costs, states have seen the real purchasing power of these gas tax revenues drop by a nationwide total of $10 billion with a B each year. The national recession also had an impact on transportation funding. Although state fiscal conditions have been gradually improving, state tax collections tend to lag behind other indicators of economic recovery and overall are just now returning to pre-recession levels. But the many competing demands for overstretched state dollars in many cases led to the diversion of transportation dedicated revenues like gas taxes to plug other holes in state budgets. And lastly, states face deep uncertainty in federal programs. Revenue from the federal gas tax has been declining for the same reasons as most state taxes in terms of purchasing power. As this graph shows, the federal tax has lost at least a third of its value since it was last raised in 1993. And at the federal level, transportation now faces its own fiscal cliff. The current federal surface transportation law, MAP 21, will expire on September 30th of this year, and without congressional action, at least the highway account of the Federal Highway Trust Fund is predicted to reach insolvency even sooner than that. It is perhaps unsurprising then that NCSL has found state legislators to be expressing the recognition that states may likely have to assume more responsibility for infrastructure planning and funding. As ongoing funding gaps hasten the decline of aging transportation infrastructure across the states, the costs of ongoing underinvestment rise. According to the American Society of Civil Engineers, deteriorating surface transportation infrastructure cost U.S. households and businesses nearly $130 billion in various costs and time delays in 2010 alone. If current trends continue, these costs will reach more than $200 billion each year in the next 6 years. NCSL and our sister organizations recognize the need for and are working to ensure a strong federal partner in transportation policy and funding into the future. But at the same time, states are asking how they can provide needed transportation infrastructure in a time of change and uncertainty, and with or without long-term sustainable federal programs. The good news is that states have made transportation a policy priority and are taking the lead in addressing the problem. On the legislative side, hundreds of bills have been considered across the states over the past 2 years, and many of the states that are still in session right now, shown in green on this map, still have legislation in play. States have a few categories of options on the table to help deliver and pay for transportation infrastructure. The rest of my remarks today will focus on funding measures, those actions that provide new or increased revenues. But states have also looked at financing options like bonding and borrowing, things that need to be paid back, as well as ways to ensure that transportation dollars are being used efficiently, accountably, and for their intended purposes. Over the past few years, legislatures seem to have looked at every possible funding option they could come up with. They've considered traditional sources like gas taxes, tolls, and registration fees, possible supplements to those sources, and an interesting grab bag of other proposals. We've seen fees on bicycle sales being considered, privatizing state liquor stores, casino revenues, cigarette taxes, and payroll taxes, as well as private sponsorship for rest stops or other transportation infrastructure. And although many of these proposals weren't enacted, it does demonstrate the breadth that states are bringing to the question. I'll be talking about 3 general trends in the transportation funding legislation that states have enacted over the past couple years. The first is gas taxes that track with the economy, then ways to capture all users of the system, and finally, authorizing local options. The proposals that received the most high-profile attention last year were the 6 states and the District of Columbia that for the first time in 4 years enacted legislation likely to increase total state taxes on gasoline. The interesting thing is almost all of these, every state on this map except Wyoming, moved toward allowing their gas taxes to track with the economy to some degree, either by tying the tax rates to a measure of inflation or by supplementing or even replacing their existing cents per gallon taxes with taxes that are based on a percentage of gas prices. And in the breaking news edition, as of yesterday, New Hampshire Senate Bill 367 is headed to the governor. And that one's interesting. It's a bit of a mix. The increase to the gas tax is going to be one time, but it will be based on an adjustment to inflation. And so far, that is the first bill that's made it most of the way through the process on gas taxes this year. Overall, last year's activity brought the number of states with variable rate gas taxes up to, we count 15 total, plus DC, plus a handful that apply their general sales taxes to gasoline as well. As a result, more than half the total U.S. population now lives in a state where the gas tax rate changes over time. It's important to remember, though, that also in the past couple years, several states have either rejected or repealed this kind of approach, in part due to concerns about the effect of the volatility of gas prices on transportation revenues, and also the political implications of what some people have called automatic tax increases. These concerns may be especially meaningful inasmuch as Senator Barbara Boxer, chair of the Senate Committee with jurisdiction over federal reauthorization, has suggested that the federal government also consider moving toward a percentage-based gas tax. To lead us into the second trend, the big question is, will raising gas taxes be enough, even if they track with the economy in some way? Many of you are doubtless familiar with the national studies that have looked at the long-term viability of relying heavily on gas taxes into the future. And this slide shows that NCSL constituents are also concerned that gas taxes will fall short. due to higher fuel efficiency in alternative fuel vehicles. As a result, in the past few years, more than half the states have introduced more than 100 bills that address possible alternatives to the gas tax. Last year alone, Colorado, North Carolina, and Virginia enacted new fees for alternative fuel or hybrid vehicles. Although Virginia immediately repealed its new and unpopular fee on hybrids this year, several states still have bills pending right now. Many states also tax alternative fuels for vehicles directly, taxing natural gas or electricity or something like that. A number of states have recently enacted bills related to these taxes as well. And finally, the most widely discussed possibility has been a fee that drivers could be charged based on the number of miles they drive rather than the gallons of gas they buy. States have shown a great deal of interest in mileage-based charges. As of last year, at least 18 states had undertaken some form of pilot project. And 4 states, Kentucky, New Mexico, New York, and Oregon, already assess taxes for heavy vehicles based on both miles traveled and vehicle weight. At least 51 related bills have been considered in 18 states since 2008. Last year, Oregon enacted high-profile legislation to create the largest proof of concept in the U.S. so far for mileage-based charges by allowing owners of up to 5,000 vehicles to opt in to pay a per-mile road usage charge rather than gas taxes. And that program will kick off in July 2015. In recent years, Indiana, Vermont, and Washington have also enacted bills to study or further develop the concept of per-mile charges. Which brings us to our third trend. And I know, although this isn't a trend that increases state revenues per se, it's an interesting trend because states are taking action to support sustainable funding across the entire network and across all levels of government, which includes regional and local entities. Localities have also been struggling with shortfalls in transportation funding, like everybody else. In the past few years, we've tracked many states that have allowed additional authority or expanded authority on the part of localities to issue bonds, to assess local option taxes or fees, or to have more spending flexibility, for example, by being able to spend revenues that are allocated to them or revenues that they collect on transit-related projects, safe routes to school, and other non-traditional projects. I'd just like to end on a note about the state-federal nexus in transportation funding. It's often noted that Oregon enacted the nation's first gas tax in 1919, and every other state followed suit before the federal government did so in 1932. So perhaps we shouldn't be surprised then, from a historical perspective, that states are once again leading the way. Thank you, and I will turn it back over to Douglas to talk about the spending side of the equation.
Thank you very much, Jamie, for that enriching and informative presentation. We're now going to take a look at what happens once the money comes in. What are state departments of transportation, in some instances with guidance or policy from state legislatures? How are they spending transportation funding, and what kind of planning decisions are they making? I'm now pleased to introduce Eric Sundquist. Eric is the Managing Director of the State Smart Transportation Initiative, SSTI. SSTI promotes transportation practices that advance environmental sustainability and equitable economic development while maintaining high standards of governmental efficiency and transparency. And SSTI participants include state departments of transportation. Before assuming the role of Managing Director in 2010 with SSTI, Eric was a Senior Associate and Policy Analyst focusing on transportation and clean energy at the Center on Wisconsin Strategy. He has also worked as a transportation researcher at Georgia Tech, as an instructor at Georgia State University, as an editor for the Journal of the American Planning Association, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, and several other newspapers. Eric will be presenting on a few travel trends that are impacting future transportation spending planning and decisions, and will share several promising strategies state DOTs are adopting or considering. So with that, go ahead and take it away, Eric.
Thanks, Douglas. I appreciate it, and I appreciate the chance to speak today and the fact that NCSL is asking this question, too often the budget issue gets framed as we have this long quote-unquote needs list. How do we go fund it? Of course, needs lists are really wants, and looking at the needs list is a good place to start in balancing the budget. But there are other things too, and so a lot of our participating DOTs are deep into this question. We are a network of DOTs housed at the University of Wisconsin, just to clarify that. We have about 15 participating DOT secretaries who meet with us. So next slide, please. So just to quickly frame this, this is to really step back. We're in a period in history now that we've seen before. We've had lots of systems that have been built in our country, then for one reason or another been disinvested or had some disruptive technology that attacked them and forced them to change. So the transit is an example. A lot of transit systems were built by developers in the early part of the century, 20th century. When they developed their neighborhoods, they had no more reason to capitalize those systems, and they gradually wore out. The map you see here is the Conrail system, if you remember, of those who are old enough. Back in the 70s, Penn Central, New York Central freight rail went out of business and was picked up by the government, reconstituted, and now has been privatized again. So we have these crisis points, and arguably we're in one right now with the highway system, which is where our DOTs spend most of their time. Next slide, please. So again, our DOT secretaries got together to form SSTI, not because there aren't enough convening venues already. They all participate in AASHTO and TRB and all sorts of things, but they were particularly interested in this new idea of a new business model. And honestly, one of the driving factors is the budget. The budgets aren't balancing anymore. Next slide, please. You've heard, a lot of people have heard about Jamie touched on this and Douglas too, but I just want to reinforce. A lot of people have talked about CAFE standards and increasing fuel mileage as one of the really major forces here, and it is, but the bigger one immediately is this fact that people are driving less. Vehicle miles traveled, or VMT, has been ticking down for a decade on the per capita side and flattened on the aggregate side. And next slide, you'll see how much of a shock this was to the system. The dark black line here is the actual travel demand, or VMT, nationally. The colored lines are all the projections done every couple of years by the US DOT, but rolled up from the states and MPOs. And you can see people haven't figured out how to react quite yet to this. The projections were all that VMT and demand would keep going up, and gas tax revenues would track along with that. The fact that that hasn't happened has been a big shock to the system, and one that is a big challenge that we're dealing with. So next slide, please. I would just, again, a little pitch for one of our products. If you're interested in learning more about some of the things I'm about to say, we have a publication on our website, which is ssti.us, called The Innovative DOT. We just updated it in January. It has a lot deeper dive into some of the things that I'm going to be talking about and other strategies that DOTs are using to cope with this new normal. Next slide, please. So on the spending side, here are a few things. I'm going to talk about 3 or 4 things. I'm not going to give you a long laundry list because that's sort of incomprehensible after a while, but I'm going to give you a few examples, and I'm going to go a little bit deeper into one particular one, and then that'll be my presentation. We'll leave time for questions. So the term asset management has become really critical in DOT world. Used to be that we looked at roads and the ones that were the worst off were the ones that we went out and worked on. Well, that's not really a very sensible strategy. Asset management implies collecting a lot more data on our assets, not just the pavements and bridges, but the guardrails, the signs, the transit vehicles, whatever it is. This is Utah uses a LiDAR detecting device to catalog the condition of their system, and then apply much more sophisticated analytics to what we go out and maintain first. You can extend the life of assets if you strategically work on them instead of just waiting for them to deteriorate into a point where you need to go out and rebuild them. So this is something that's not very sexy, but it's expensive to get going, and it requires a new way of looking at things for DOTs. But they're all trying to do it. I would say some of those that we work with have had trouble because of zero-based budgeting and departments of finance who don't see this as critical. So I'm putting in a little pitch that if you hear about asset management, you be sympathetic to the ask there. Next slide, please. Another big buzzword is called life cycle cost accounting. This is just good practice under government accounting standards, but not used that much in transportation until recently. It means that before you go build something, you figure out how much it's going to cost you over the life cycle of the facility. So you don't end up with a system where you capitalize stuff and then leave somebody else holding the bag to try to maintain it down the road. No pun intended. But that's what we've done in the past, and that's one reason we're in the position that we are. It makes you much more sober about what you invest in. Next slide, please. DOTs are looking to pinch pennies and save money wherever they can in terms of operations and collecting more data so this is as opposed to just in assets. This is a MassDOT example where they've not only got some financial imperatives but also environmental, and so they're taking a strong look at where they use water, energy, and that kind of thing. They run a large transit system, so energy is a major concern for them there. But all DOTs have fleets, and they have buildings and all kinds of stuff where they can save. Next slide, please. But in terms of the big money, it's really in the capital for most DOTs. And so you hear these slogans like fix it first, which might be more sophisticated to say system preservation, means the same thing basically, and right sizing. So I lumped these two together because they basically amount to a more conservative capital approach. And I mentioned life cycle costing, which can be part of this too, but I wanted to pull that out separately. But at any rate, the fix it first, as it clearly states, is making sure that you can take care of your existing system before you add on. Right sizing is that when you add on, you do it judiciously and make sure that you're not adding on something that you can't maintain. So an example in Tennessee from a couple of years ago was putting on hold and maybe even killing the NAFTA highway, Interstate 69. Interstate 69 sort of exists in bits and pieces, but the part through Tennessee was deemed too expensive for what Tennessee was going to get out of it, so it's now on hold, even though it's a very high-profile highway. Next slide, please. More systematically, Pennsylvania looked at the same question. They were spending 25% of their highway dollars on new capacity back in the early 2000s. And this is in a state that wasn't growing in terms of population very much and had a huge backlog of broken bridges. So just by being more careful about what they invested in, they've gone down in terms of capacity adding projects and really gone into that backlog of broken bridges. And they weren't, I don't think they could foresee the future, but this hit just at the right time when VMT started falling. So by taking some of these capacity projects off the table or downsizing them, they hit right at the time when people started driving a little bit less. So they haven't seen a lot more congestion out of this. So it's been kind of a win-win. Next slide. Another example of this sort of thing is called Practical Design out of Missouri, DOT. They decided we could either do a few things perfectly or a lot of things well. So they give their engineers a lot more leeway in terms of how they design projects. Do they build them to the nth degree of the design manual, or do they put some compromises in and spread the dollars around more? And they've found that they've had no safety impacts, but been able to do a lot more work that way. So next slide, please. So I want to spend the next 4 or 5 minutes and finish up on an issue that you've probably heard of and is as widely excited people in the transportation field called big data. In the private sector here, you see that corporations are getting a wide range of benefits out of new big data and analytic capacity that comes along with the big data, operational efficiencies, customer experience, and even disruptions that create new business models. And that could all help us too. So next slide, please. Just as one example of that, the clothing store was predicting when they would run out of stock and when they needed to restock, and that was the red line here, just based on historical trends. And you could see the classic prediction was off by 63%, so pretty bad. They applied a new set of data to it, and this neuro-Bayes analytic method, which I'm at a loss to be able to explain, but have ratcheted that down to 11% off. So that's what we would like to see in our field. Next slide, please. But I will just remind you, this is what we still have. So we have a long way to go, even though we're starting to get into it. Next slide, please. Not only is business using big data to do what they were doing better, but doing new things too. So as an example, the logistics company DHL is crowdsourcing last mile delivery. So if they know that you're going to be going on a certain route every day, you might be able to stop by their office, pick up a package, and take it to the place where you're going and be part of their delivery network. It's really a disruptive new business model for that replaces a lot of costs for them. So again, there's things that we can look at in transportation and learn and do. Next slide, please. One of the key issues is the way we look at transportation infrastructure. We talk about networks, and people tend to talk about water and power and road networks all in the same way. But they're really not, because if you put a drop of water into the pipes or an electron into the wires, you don't really care where it ends up. But people are using roads to get from one place to another, and that's often missed. And it's critical. It's something big data can help us with. So next slide, please. We call this the origin-destination question. As I mentioned, it's often just ignored. We have surveys that are expensive and sporadic. The one in Madison is over 12 years old, and so lots of things have changed since it was last done. We never really directly observe it. The surveys are small samples. And instead what we do is look at how many cars are on a road and how fast they're going, or possibly how many people are on a transit line or walking in some cases. Usually it is cars, though. But the volume and speed in the quote-unquote pipes is a really poor substitute for getting people where they want to go. Next slide, please. Just as an example, if all we measure is sort of the impedance in the pipe, the slowness, the delay in the pipes, Atlanta looks a lot better than Chicago because the percentage of time spent in delay is much less. Yet, because the distances traveled to get to work are much more in Atlanta, it takes longer to get to work. So if you looked at delay again, or impedance, or in the pipes, you think Atlanta's great and Chicago's bad, but if you're actually experiencing going to work, I think you would prefer Chicago quite a bit. Next slide, please. This is an example of the technology that I'm talking about. I'm just going to mention quickly that it comes from cell phone, people traveling around with cell phones in this particular case. There's a company called AirSage that's starting to provide these products to the industry. And so this example that I'm going to give comes from cell phone data. Next slide, please. In North Carolina, US 1, which sort of is the highway that moves diagonally up this slide, was congested. And the state DOT was thinking of building a bypass around the Pinehurst area, which makes sense because there's a lot of cars on the road and maybe you should get them off and provide more capacity. Next slide, please. But when they looked at where people were coming and going, about over half of the people were coming into Pinehurst and going out. About a third were traveling around Pinehurst, and only about 13 were going through it. So you build this big facility to go around Pinehurst for 13%. It probably didn't make sense. But without the origin and destination, you would never have known that. Next slide, please. So when you look blind, again, just to be more general about it, when you look blindly at a road, you just see the flows. Next slide, please. If you look at origins and destinations, it suggests a lot more options. So if people are kind of jumping on the highway to get 2 blocks down and getting off because they can't get across the highway, then maybe you need more connectivity. And so that's where a lot of excitement is going right now, and we can, hope that that will lead to much more cost-effective solutions and more sustainable ones. Next slide, please. There's one more example. This is from Orlando. A and B are properties that abut each other at the backyard, and they're houses, but they could be a house and a school or 2 businesses. But if you want to drive from one to the other, it's 7 miles. So if we didn't know that somebody was trying to get from A to B, and again, maybe it is a school, and there's a lot of kids trying to get to that school from the other neighborhood, all we would see was that there were a lot of cars and a lot of congestion on the pipes, and we would widen that 7 miles to get them from one to the other, when a bike path from A to B might solve the problem in 1/100th of the cost or less. Next slide. And this works in transit too. I know some state DOTs have more to do with transit than others, but all of them pass money through and care about it. This is the last example that I'm going to give, but this is Dubuque, Iowa. The current routes for the transit system are on the left. They looked at these origin and destinations off of cell phones and optimized the routes, and you can see at the bottom they reduced operating costs by 40%. They met demand better by 37% and then reduced travel time. So better results for less money. That's really what it's all about, and that's what the big data stuff is promises for us. We just need to sort of crack the code and get this stuff out into general practice. So there's still some hurdles to get over in doing that, but I'm going to end here and see if others want to, if you have questions about that, I'm happy to take them, or anything else.
Hello, thank you very much, Eric, for that presentation. And that interesting look at how states are adjusting to travel trends and wisely spending their transportation dollars. I would highly recommend taking a look at SSTI's innovative DOT handbook. It contains a lot of compelling state best practices and great detail and supporting research, so definitely take a look at that. My first question, I think it's for both of you, but Eric, if you want to take the first crack at trying to answer it, what do you think is the biggest challenge or opportunity, depending on how you want to look at it, for state legislators with regards to state transportation funding and spending over the next 10 years or so? And I'll let Eric take the first crack at that.
Oh, man. Let me leave aside the funding part because Jamie talked about that, and I think she did a great job and could answer it just better than I probably. On the spending side, I think the idea that not all the solutions to our transportation problems are supply problems. So there's lots to be done in terms of transportation demand management, additional connectivity, particularly in urban areas where the congestion is. I mean, traditionally, the solution has been there's a lot of cars on the road, we need to widen it. That's just unbearably expensive. It burdens us with maintenance costs down the road that we can't afford already. So there's a mental leap there because elected officials naturally want to show something in real time in a project, that, a shovel-ready project that you build and expand something or is new is always very attractive, but getting away from that to the extent possible, or at least balancing that with these other solutions that involve things other than capacity. And it could even be transit capacity. I don't mean to just hit on highways, but transit can be very expensive too. And some of these other strategies may be more effective and certainly more cost-effective than big projects, be they transit or highways.
And I guess I'll take it from there. I guess that's a big question. Biggest challenges, biggest opportunities for legislators. I think Eric and I and Douglas all talked about, 3 major areas of changes that are going on that are leading us to ask these questions. There's issues of major funding shortfalls. There's big shifts in travel patterns, and then there is big changes in technology, both in terms of alternative fuel and high-efficiency vehicles, but then also this big data that Eric is talking about that allows us to see what's really happening on the ground and what the people are looking for in terms of their travel needs. And just to step back and take a historical perspective again, you know, those three things are also what we saw in other major shifts in America's transportation policy decisions. You know, Oregon was the first state to tax gasoline starting in 1919. What was happening? Big changes in technology, right? Automobiles were on the rise. All of the other states followed. By 1929. We go into the Great Depression, and then by 1932, the first federal gas tax is signed into law at the rate of a penny a gallon as initially a short-term budget fix, right? But it grew into be something else eventually in 1956, when we're seeing big shifts in travel patterns, demographic shifts, changes in land use, and that's when President Eisenhower signs the Federal Aid Highway Act to fund the new interstate system. So I think what we've seen over time is that these three drivers continue to present opportunities that maybe in the moment don't look like opportunities, but they end up being. And when I travel around the country talking to people in state houses, what I'm really hearing is that same kind of crisis/opportunity tension. You know, that this is a chance to look at everything that's possible on the table, but also think really creatively, and I think Eric really got to this, about how are we going to move forward from here? Both how are we going to bring the money in, but what is it that we're doing? How are people getting from point A to point B? How do we tie revenues to actual spending? How do we tie revenues to use of the system? How do we make it all work together sustainably into the future?
Great stuff. Thanks, Jamie and Eric. This is certainly an exciting and challenging time in transportation policy, so lots to talk about. Let's, Eric, how about another question for you? Are there any state DOTs rigorously evaluating the cost of using private contractors compared to in-house staff before increasing contracting services?
Contractors, so you probably mean consultants, right? Because they all contract with construction companies to build stuff. Nobody builds their own roads. And the answer to that is yes. This is one of those questions that is fraught with both politics, because there are employee unions. There are good reasons and bad politically and functionally to consult out. It's a very complicated one, and I'd say almost everybody has looked at this question. And do I know who's the best at it? I'm not sure, but if somebody wanted to email me, we could explore it. But yes, it's an ongoing question. I mean, some of the downs, you lose some control when you can do consulting, outsourcing. The consultants then become a political power of their own. So you might say, well, the public union is too strong, for example, and but then there's a political balance that swings over to a private sector that has a special interest. So people are experimenting with different you know, slices of the pie for that, and I don't know that anybody has an optimum solution yet.
Thanks a lot for that, Eric. And I do want to mention the webinar slides will be available afterwards, and we will send that in a link, and they will be actually posted to the website page where everyone registered for the meeting. Question for I think all of us, but we'll have Jamie and I kick off, is have you heard any good ideas to justify putting more money into freight and passenger rail for less abuse to highways? On the passenger rail side, we've definitely seen some movements in the recent future amongst states to kind of take more of the onus on to fund and support transit, and we're actually going to be doing a comprehensive report funded by the Rockefeller Foundation to see how states do fund and support transit, so look for that later this year, and I'll let Jamie chime in with some thoughts on that.
Sure, and I'm afraid this is a little bit more about just public transportation generally as opposed to rail specifically, but we have seen some states make that argument really explicitly that that investing in alternative modes of transportation is highway related because it takes some of the traffic off the highway in theory, and it reduces wear and tear. We particularly saw that in Colorado. Last year, Colorado enacted Senate Bill 48, And that was, again, one of these local authority bills. It allowed local governments to use revenues from the Highway User Tax Fund for transit. And part of the reason that that flexibility has existed for the state in the past and now for localities is that the argument has been made that transit investments are highway related, so you can use the Highway User Tax Fund for those investments.
Eric, do you have any thoughts on this, in particular with on the freight rail side? And I'm not sure if we have as good a handle on that, but that is certainly a very important and compelling example of trying to take freight truck traffic off roads. Any thoughts there?
Yeah, no, it really is, and probably dollar for dollar, if you can get the trucks off you, because a truck imposes much more burden on a road by, orders of magnitude than a car. I mean, it's hundreds or thousands of cars worth for every truck. So diverting trucks is really cost effective if you can do it. It also adds to quality of life and reduces congestion. So a great example of that in California is the Alameda Corridor project, which got a lot of the truck traffic from the LA and Long Beach ports onto rail. It isn't new anymore. It's been there. It started, I don't know when it opened, but a decade ago or so. It's been a big success and a big, something that a good model. Another example in California, the Port of Stockton in the Central Valley handles a lot of, or could handle a lot of produce coming from the Central Valley and agricultural products that now flow on trucks down to Oakland. And so they got a Tiger grant to load ships and to build the facilities to load ships at that port. Unfortunately, I think the operating expenses there are maybe not forthcoming, so that isn't doing as much as it could. But that has the potential to take tens of thousands of trucks off the road and just be a major, major player. They could run so much of the, so think about not just rail, but waterborne freight as well.
Great, thanks a lot, Eric. And that Alameda example is particularly pertinent here. I think that's such a congested area, and the freight rail is such an important piece around there. It was nice that they figured out a solution that was kind of somewhat mutually beneficial. And I'm now going to turn back over to Jamie.
Yeah, I have to chime in here because I want to thank Patricia Higgins, who sent in a correction to the New Hampshire example. Patricia, I'm so sorry. I went on today and I was frenetically clicking around right before the webinar trying to get the latest information on the New Hampshire bill, but I guess the bill versions I pulled up were not the current one. So Patricia says, yesterday we passed the increase to the road toll, aka gas tax, but the indexing to CPI was stripped out in the Senate. So the bill now has a 4.2-cent increase, she says, the first since 1991, added to what was 18 cents a gallon. Thank you, Patricia. So it sounds like this is a straight gas tax increase similar to, in approach to what Wyoming did last year.
Eric, a question for you. Has SSTI been looking at what the change in age demographics is going to do to transportation mobility demands at state DOTs?
Yeah, and yes. So among others, a lot of people have been looking at the demographics. There were some papers done 10 years ago predicting that we were going to see easing in vehicle miles traveled. None of them predicted it was actually going to turn the opposite direction. But that was mainly based on aging of baby boomers and moving past the peak driving years. Nobody really foresaw the millennials in their sort of preference toward more urban or less car-based, less driving. From wherever that is. So yeah, people are closely watching demographics. People are watching land use. I mean, there's been a lot of reforms in land use since zoning codes based on auto-centric development were enacted back in the 50s and 60s. We now allow for mixed-use development and more compact development, so that is probably having an effect. There are a lot of drivers or potential drivers to this VMT trend. And that raises one interesting thing that is worth noting. State DOTs got set up to provide transportation from city to city, not within cities. But as sprawl happened and cities grew or metro areas grew, they ended up providing mostly local transportation. So that's a huge issue. It's what should the state be doing and what should local government be doing and who should contribute to it. And it varies from state to state on it's just a question that's evolved. Nobody's really sat down and said this is the rational way to delineate these responsibilities. So the state, sometimes it's hard to separate out the state DOT's responsibility from the MPOs and the local units of government in terms of that. So I think the answer to what are VMT trends meaning for states varies by how they answer that question in part.
Thanks, Eric. We've been getting a lot of questions about mileage-based user fees. This question's for Jamie. Do you think that mileage-based user fees are technically and politically feasible?
Boy, that's two questions rolled into one. And you know, as our friend Jung Lee over at AASHTO likes to say, it's not a technical problem, it's a political problem. So technically speaking, mileage-based user fees are already possible. Oregon has already had pilot projects where they've actually collected real money from real participants. So the technology is in place, and there are protections that are available for privacy and so on if you're using a system that is tracking where you're going, although Oregon also allows people to opt out entirely or to use something that's based more on something like an odometer reading so that nobody knows where you are, they just know how much you've traveled. And there are pros and cons to all those different approaches, but part of what Oregon found in terms of gaining widespread acceptance was that you needed to give people ways to figure out the best way for them to both report their mileage and pay their fee. In terms of whether there's an appetite nationwide for mileage-based user fees, I mean, I think we see in terms of state stakeholders and state leaders that there's a great deal of interest in what options will be available to supplement or even replace the gas tax going into the future. And mileage-based user fees have always been the most logical and interesting option on the table, I would say. And there have been many national studies that have pointed it out as the primary option going into the future. But is the population at large interested in it? You know, I think this is a lot of why people are watching Oregon to see how some of these concerns and possible benefits play out in practice. I think it's also interesting to note that one of the bills that was passed this year in Washington has a part in it about looking at interjurisdictional issues. You know, what happens if somebody participating in a mileage-based charge crosses a state line, and what happens if there's a neighboring state with that system or not. So they're going to be looking at that, I think, throughout the western region of North America, and that's another thing that people are watching. And I think that at least openness to the possibility might grow as people see it actually play out in a proof of concept in Oregon.
Very good. I see that we're getting quite a few questions wondering about the kind of weight distance possibility of funding as well. Representative Anderson from Utah chimed in asking, there was mention made about variable taxes for passenger vehicles based on weight. Does the weight of a passenger vehicle impact the roadway enough to justify including it in the taxing formula? Any thoughts on that, Jamie? And then we'll go to Eric after that.
Yeah. Certainly people have been talking about that quite a bit. And that comes up in the weight distance taxes that are already in place for heavy vehicles. It's also come up in some of the study bills, states that have been looking at study bills that say, well, let's look at variable rate taxes that include both mileage and weight. So I think, you know, wear and tear is definitely part of it. The way that Oregon broke it down was based on actually efficiency, fuel efficiency. So of the 5,000 participating vehicles, no more than 1,500 of those can have a rating of less than 17 miles per gallon. So I think that's another way to kind of get at that same issue in a different way while also touching on some other policy goals.
Eric, any thoughts on that from a state DOT perspective?
I haven't heard people. So the difference between a truck and a car is so huge, or even a full truck and an empty truck. That makes a big difference. The difference between an SUV and a Prius in terms of wear and tear. I mean, I don't know what your threshold is for significance here, but it's much less. We'll just say that. And when you're doing the VMT fee, it's not just paying for the wear and tear on the pavement, but just providing the facility in the first place. There's a lot of other costs that aren't related to the weight. So I I haven't heard a lot of discussion about adjusting the VMT fee for weight of cars. Cars would be one thing, but then again, this is all an evolving thing, and it may well be.
Yeah, and I'll just throw out the specific bill number that I was thinking of as it came to me. So it was the Indiana bill that was enacted this year. To the best of my knowledge, that bill, which is House Bill 1104, that one requires a study of alternative funding mechanisms, including an option that's based on variables including vehicle gross weight and miles traveled. So yeah, Eric, I completely agree, and we've gotten questions here sometimes about obviously commercial vehicles being separate from personal vehicles, but then even cars being separate from things like motorcycles, also because there's kind of a qualitative difference there.
And we got a question regarding any awareness of states that fund mobility management programs. And I'm aware of the Washington Commute Trip Reduction Program, which is kind of a showcase program, has been very successful in reducing single occupancy vehicle trips in Washington. That is a program that requires employers with more than 100 employees in certain populated areas to basically have a dedicated staffer to help with coming up with mobility options for their employers, and that also involves state money and rigorous kind of data analysis, and I can send more information on that along. Eric, do you have any sense of that as far as state involvement in encouraging mobility management?
Yeah, another example is Mass Rides, which is run by MassDOT and of course Massachusetts. It's a TDM plan that works with employers. And a number of states fund these efforts at the local level. So most of them are run out of the local level, but often they have some state support. So California provides a fair amount of state support. They used to have a statewide program, but it's now devolved to the local level, but still supported at the state level.
Okay, thank you very much, Eric, and thank you, Jamie. I think we've reached the end of our time. I want to thank everyone for joining us. This has been a spirited and informative conversation, so appreciate that. As a reminder, the webinar presentations will be available online at the following web address within 5 days, and we will send a follow-up email with that link, as well as a link to the Natural Resources and Infrastructure Committee's webinar series. Thanks again to the Rockefeller Foundation for supporting this webinar. And as a reminder, the Natural Resources and Infrastructure Committee webinar series will continue next Thursday with a webinar on net metering and the costs and benefits of rooftop solar. That will take place next Thursday at 3 Eastern, 2 Central, 1 Mountain, and 1 noon Pacific. So thanks everyone for joining us, and please follow up with questions to Jamie and I, and we'll be happy to get back to you with resources. Thanks a lot, and take care.